The wind carried whispers of a coming storm across the vast plains of Wyoming Territory, as Sheriff Samuel Reed squinted at the dusty horizon, a feeling of unease creeping down his spine. It was 1878, and Sweetwater County had seen its share of trouble's outlaws, cattle rustlers, and the occasional drifter bringing trouble to town, but nothing had prepared him for what he would find that sweltering afternoon in August. Samuel wiped sweat from his brow, adjusting his worn Stetson as he guided his chestnut mare along the lonely trail back to Clearwater Springs. He'd spent the morning investigating reports of stolen cattle at the Hawkins Ranch, and the ride back promised to be long and hot. His thoughts drifted to the stack of wanted posters awaiting him at his office, and the cold beer that would follow once the day's duties were complete. The mare suddenly tensed beneath him, ears pricking forward toward something in the distance. Samuel followed her gaze, squinting against the harsh sunlight. At first he thought it might be a bundle of rags or perhaps an abandoned sack of goods, but as he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. There, half buried in the dust of the trail, lay a young woman. She was curled up like a child, her once fine dress now tattered and filthy, her face smudged with dirt and tear tracks. For a terrible moment, Samuel feared she was dead, but then he caught the faint rise and fall of her chest. "Good Lord," he muttered, dismounting quickly. He approached cautiously, one hand resting on his holstered Colt. In these parts, caution was as necessary as water. "Miss, can you hear me?" She didn't stir. Up close, he could see she was young, perhaps 20 or so, with matted auburn hair that might have been beautiful if not for the days of grime. Her skin was sunburnt and cracked, her lips parched. How long had she been out here in the unforgiving wilderness? Samuel knelt beside her, gently pressing his fingers to her neck. Her pulse fluttered weakly against his fingertips. She was alive, but barely. Acting quickly, he shrugged off his long leather duster and wrapped it around her frail form. The temperature would drop dramatically once the sun set, and she clearly couldn't withstand any more exposure. "Hold on now," he said softly, knowing she probably couldn't hear him. "I've got you." With as much care as he could manage, Samuel lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and that worried him even more. He whistled for his mare, who obediently trotted over, and then faced the challenge of mounting while holding the unconscious woman. After some awkward maneuvering, he settled her in front of him on the saddle, one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins with his free hand. He could feel her shallow breathing and the slight tremor running through her body. "Clearwater Springs isn't far," he told her, urging his horse forward at a steady pace. "You just hold on, miss. I'll get you somewhere safe." As they rode, Samuel couldn't help but wonder about the mystery woman in his arms. Her clothes, though tattered, were of good quality. She wore no wedding ring. There'd been no reports of missing women in the area, and the nearest stagecoach route was miles away. How had she ended up alone and unconscious in the middle of nowhere? The sun was beginning its descent when the small town of Clearwater Springs came into view. A collection of wooden buildings, a church with a modest steeple, and a scattering of homes made up the settlement that Samuel had called home for the past 5 years. After the war, he drifted west seeking something he couldn't name and eventually pinned on a badge when the previous sheriff was killed in a shootout. People stopped to stare as he rode down Main Street with the unconscious woman. Mrs. Halloway, the town gossip, was already hurrying from the general store, her eyes wide with curiosity. Samuel headed straight for Doc Miller's office, ignoring the questions shouted his way. "Doc," he called, reining in his horse outside the small clapboard building with its weathered shingle advertising medical services. "Doc Miller." The door swung open to reveal a man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles, and a head of white hair. His sleeves were rolled up, and he wiped his hands on a cloth as he stepped onto the porch. "What's all this commotion, Sheriff?" Doc Miller asked, then noticed the bundle in Samuel's arms. "Good heavens, who's that?" "Found her out on the North Trail," Samuel explained, carefully dismounting while keeping his hold on the woman. "Unconscious, dehydrated for certain, don't know how long she's been out there." The doctor's expression turned serious. "Bring her in quickly now." Inside, the doctor's office was clean and orderly, with the faint smell of carbolic acid hanging in the air. Samuel laid the woman gently on the examination table as directed, reluctant to remove his coat from around her, despite the warmth of the room. "I'll need to examine her properly, Sheriff," Doc Miller said, reaching for his stethoscope. "Perhaps you could wait outside." Samuel hesitated, feeling strangely protective of the stranger he'd found. "I should probably get back to the office, but I'd appreciate if you'd send word once you know more about her condition." The doctor nodded, already focused on his patient. "I'll have my wife fetch you the moment she wakes, if she wakes. Can't promise anything just yet." As Samuel stepped outside, he found a small crowd had gathered, including Mayor Phillips and his wife. "What's this? I hear about you finding a woman out in the wilderness," the mayor asked, his mustache twitching with interest. "Not much to tell yet, Mayor," Samuel replied, untying his horse from the hitching post. "Found her unconscious about 5 miles north of town. No sign of anyone else around, no horse, no belongings." "Poor thing," Mrs. Phillips clucked sympathetically. "Could she be from that stagecoach that was robbed last week near Timberline Pass?" Samuel frowned, considering the possibility. "Could be, though that's a mighty long way for someone to wander, especially on foot." "Well, if she needs a place to stay once Doc Miller's done with her, the boarding house has a vacant room," Mayor Phillips offered. "Town can cover the cost until we figure out who she is." Samuel nodded gratefully. The people of Clearwater Springs might love their gossip, but they took care of their own, and apparently that extended to mysterious strangers as well. "I appreciate that, Mayor. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should get back to my duties." As he walked his horse toward the sheriff's office and adjoining jail, Samuel found his thoughts returning to the woman. There was something about her beyond the obvious circumstances of their meeting that had struck him. Maybe it was the peaceful expression on her face despite her dire situation, or perhaps the delicate curve of her cheek beneath the dirt and grime. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had somehow changed the moment he spotted her lying in the dust. 3 days passed before Doc Miller's wife came hurrying into the sheriff's office, her gray hair escaping from its usual tight bun. "Sheriff Reed, she's awake and asking for you," Mrs. Miller announced, slightly out of breath. Samuel looked up from the wanted poster he'd been studying. "She's asking for me, by name." "Well, no," Mrs. Miller admitted. "She's asking about the man who saved her, says she remembers being carried on horseback and covered with a coat. That would be you, wouldn't it?" Samuel stood, reaching for his hat. "How is she?" "Weak still, but alert. Doc says she was severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure, but she's young and strong, should make a full recovery." Mrs. Miller hesitated, then added, "She says her name is Abigail, Abigail Blackwood. I mean, Abigail Bennet." Samuel nodded, placing his hat on his head. "Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Miller. I'll be right over." He found himself uncharacteristically nervous as he crossed the street to the doctor's office. What would he say to her? What would she tell him about how she'd ended up alone in the wilderness? He reminded himself that this was official business, a potential crime victim requiring the sheriff's attention, but he couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation in his chest. Doc Miller greeted him at the door, speaking in hushed tones. "She's still quite fragile, Sheriff." Try not to upset her with too many questions just yet. I understand, Doc. Just want to check on her and maybe get some basic information if she's up to it. The doctor nodded and led him to a small room at the back of the building where patients who needed overnight observation were kept. There were only 2 such rooms, and Samuel knew from experience that serious cases were often treated in people's homes when these were occupied. "Miss Bennet," Doc Miller said softly as they entered, "Sheriff Reed is here to see you." The woman sitting propped up in the narrow bed looked remarkably different from the one Samuel had found in the dust. Her face was clean now, revealing fair skin with a dusting of freckles across her nose. Her auburn hair had been washed and brushed, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that caught Samuel's attention, a clear, intelligent green that seemed to look right through him. "Sheriff," she said, her voice slightly raspy, but with a genteel accent that hinted at an Eastern upbringing. "I understand I have you to thank for my life." Samuel removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his dusty clothes and unshaven jaw. "Just doing my job, Miss Bennet. Found you out on the North Trail a few days back. Can you tell me how you came to be there?" A shadow passed over her face and she glanced away. "It's somewhat complicated. I was traveling on the stagecoach from Cheyenne when we were attacked by bandits." Samuel moved closer, interest piqued. "The Timberline Pass robbery. That was nearly a week ago and a good 30 miles from where I found you." She nodded, fingers clutching at the blanket covering her. "After they robbed the passengers, they took me with them, said I'd fetch a good price somewhere." Her voice wavered slightly. "I managed to escape 2 nights ago when they were drunk. I've been walking ever since, hiding during the day, moving at night. I must have finally collapsed from exhaustion." Samuel's jaw tightened at her story. He'd heard rumors of women being abducted and sold to remote mining camps or worse, but it hadn't happened in his jurisdiction before. "Can you describe these men, Miss Bennet? How many were there?" "3, she replied, a tremor in her voice. "One they called Dutch, a big man with a scar through his right eyebrow. Another was smaller with a red bandana he wore around his neck. The leader," she hesitated. "He had cold eyes, blue like ice. They called him Garrett." Samuel's blood ran cold. The description matched that of Garrett Thornton, a notorious outlaw with a reputation for brutality. His gang had been terrorizing the territory for months. "You've been very brave, Miss Bennet," he said gently. "And you're safe now. I promise you that." She met his eyes, vulnerability evident in her gaze. "Thank you, Sheriff, for finding me, for your coat." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I remember feeling its weight and warmth even before I fully woke." Something stirred in Samuel's chest at her words. "It was nothing, miss. Anyone would have done the same." Doc Miller cleared his throat. "I think that's enough for now, Sheriff. Miss Bennet needs her rest." Samuel nodded, backing toward the door. "Of course. Miss Bennet, once you're feeling stronger, I'll need a full statement from you about what happened. In the meantime, the town has arranged a room for you at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house when the doctor says you're ready to leave." "That's very kind," she replied, "but I'm afraid I have no money to pay for lodging. The bandits took everything I had." "Don't you worry about that," Samuel assured her. "The town's covering it until you're back on your feet. Clearwater Springs takes care of its own." A small, grateful smile curved her lips. "Even strangers found in the dust." "Especially them," Samuel replied with a smile of his own before replacing his hat. "Good day, Miss Bennet. I'll check on you again tomorrow if that's all right." As he left the doctor's office, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Abigail Bennet's story than she was telling. Her account aligned with what they knew about the stagecoach robbery, but something in the way she'd hesitated when describing the outlaws made him wonder if she was holding something back. Whatever secrets Abigail Bennet carried, One thing was certain: Garrett Thornton and his gang were now Samuel's top priority. If they were operating this close to Clearwater Springs, every person in town was potentially at risk. And Samuel had made a promise to keep Abigail safe, a promise he intended to keep. The following week saw Abigail move to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a two-story structure with a wide front porch where the landlady often sat rocking and observing the town's comings and goings. Samuel found himself creating reasons to pass by several times a day, tipping his hat when he caught sight of Abigail sitting in the fresh air, her strength gradually returning. On one such afternoon, he finally worked up the courage to approach her directly. She was reading a book borrowed from the town's small library, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. "Afternoon, Miss Bennet," he greeted, removing his hat. "How are you feeling today?" She looked up, that same small smile gracing her features. "Much better, thank you, Sheriff. Dr. Miller says I'm making excellent progress. Glad to hear it." He shifted his weight, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "I was wondering if you might feel up to giving me that statement about what happened, whenever you're ready, of course." Abigail marked her place in the book and set it aside. "I can do that now if you have the time." Samuel glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who was watching them with undisguised interest from her rocking chair. "Perhaps we could walk to my office. It's not far and the air would do you good." Abigail hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Let me just get my shawl." As they walked slowly down Main Street, Samuel was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. Abigail seemed to notice as well, keeping her eyes downcast. "Don't mind them," Samuel said quietly. "Small town, not much happens here to talk about." "Until a half-dead woman is found in the dust," she replied with a hint of wry humor that surprised him. "Until then," he agreed with a chuckle. Inside the sheriff's office, Samuel offered her a chair and poured them both cups of coffee from the pot warming on the small stove. The jail cells behind his desk were empty at present, for which he was grateful. "Now then," he said, taking his seat across from her and pulling out a sheet of paper to take notes. "Why don't you start at the beginning? What brought you to Wyoming Territory in the first place?" Abigail wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, seeming to draw strength from its warmth. "I came west to take a position as a schoolteacher in Fort Bridger. My parents died last year influenza, and there wasn't much left for me in Boston." "I'm sorry for your loss," Samuel said sincerely. She acknowledged this with a nod. "Thank you, it was difficult." They left some debts, so after the house was sold and everything settled, I had just enough for the train ticket west and a little to start over. I answered an advertisement for teachers in the Western Territories. "That's how you ended up on that stagecoach?" "Yes." "The train took me as far as Cheyenne, and then I boarded the stagecoach to complete the journey." Her voice faltered slightly. "We were about a day out when the robbery happened. There were 6 passengers plus the driver and guard. The bandits shot the guard immediately. They ordered everyone out and took our valuables." Samuel watched her carefully as she spoke, noting the way her fingers tightened around the cup, the slight tremor in her voice. "And then they singled you out." Abigail nodded, her gaze fixed on the desk between them. "The one called Garrett. He said I was too pretty to waste. The other passengers tried to intervene, one man in particular, an older gentleman. They shot him for his troubles." Her voice caught. "They tied my hands and put me on one of their horses. The last I saw of the other passengers, they were being left on the side of the road as the stagecoach burned." Samuel made notes, his jaw tight with anger. "Did the gang mention where they were taking you?" "They talked about a place called Devil's Canyon. Said there was a man there who'd appreciate my company and pay well for it." A flash of something, fear, anger, or perhaps both, crossed her features. "I knew what that meant." Devil's Canyon, Samuel repeated, writing it down. The place was notorious a hideout for outlaws and those looking to disappear, situated in the mountains about 50 miles northwest of Clearwater Springs. How did you manage to escape? Here, Abigail's demeanor changed subtly. She sat straighter, a determination hardening her features. They underestimated me. On the second night, they were drinking heavily. The one called Dutch was supposed to be watching me, but he passed out. I'd been working at the ropes around my wrists whenever they weren't looking. Once he was unconscious, I managed to free myself, took a canteen and some jerky and ran. Samuel couldn't help but admire her courage. That was incredibly brave, Miss Bennet. She gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. It was survive or, well, survive seemed the better option. I didn't know where I was going, just away from them. I tried to head east, thinking I might find a settlement or a ranch after that. I don't remember much until waking up at Dr. Miller's. You walked for days with barely any supplies, Samuel said, shaking his head in amazement. Most men couldn't have done what you did. A faint blush colored her cheeks at his praise. I did what was necessary, Sheriff. Nothing more. Call me Samuel, he said, the words coming out before he could think better of them. Since you're likely to be in town for a while, there's no need to stand on formality. She seemed surprised but pleased. Samuel, then, and you must call me Abigail, he nodded, trying to ignore the way his name sounded different when she said it. Abigail. I'm going to wire the marshal's office about Thornton's gang. With a witness to their latest crimes, we might finally have a chance at bringing them to justice. A shadow passed over her face. You think they'll come looking for me? It wasn't a question, but Samuel answered anyway. It's possible. But Clearwater Springs is a long way from their usual haunts, and they have no reason to think you'd end up here specifically. But if they do come, she pressed, other people could be hurt because of me. Samuel leaned forward, meeting her worried gaze directly. Listen to me, Abigail. What happened wasn't your fault, and protecting the people of this town, including you, is my job. I'm good at my job. After a moment, she nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Thank you for believing me, for helping me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me that day. Let's be glad we don't have to find out, Samuel replied with a reassuring smile. Now, is there anyone we should contact for you? Family back east who might be worried? Abigail shook her head. There's no one. Just the school board in Fort Bridger expecting a teacher who's now several days late. I'll send a wire to them as well, explaining the circumstances. I'm sure they'll understand the delay. As Samuel walked Abigail back to the boarding house, they fell into easy conversation about Clearwater Springs and its inhabitants. He found himself telling her about how he'd come to be sheriff, about his time serving in the Union Army during the war, and his drifting years afterward. And what about family? She asked as they approached Mrs. Henderson's. Do you have any? A sister in St. Louis, he replied. Married with 3 children now, we write occasionally. My parents passed on years ago, father during the war, mother not long after. I'm sorry, Abigail said softly. It's hard, isn't it, being the one left behind? The understanding in her voice resonated with something deep inside him. It is, but you find ways to go on. They paused at the bottom of the boarding house steps, neither seeming eager to end their conversation. Well, Samuel finally said, replacing his hat, I should let you rest. Thank you for your statement. I'll send those wires first thing tomorrow. Will you let me know if you hear anything? About the gang, I mean, Abigail asked. Of course. Though I hope the next time we speak, it's about pleasanter topics. He tipped his hat. Good evening, Abigail. Good evening, Samuel, she replied with a smile that stayed with him long after he'd returned to his office. Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel found himself seeking out Abigail's company with increasing frequency. He brought her news of his correspondence with territorial authorities about Thornton's gang. But they also spoke of books, music, and their differing experiences of life in the East versus the frontier. To his surprise, Abigail showed no eagerness to continue her journey to Fort Bridger once she was fully recovered. When he asked about it, she admitted that the school board had already hired another teacher after receiving no word from her. "It seems Clearwater Springs is stuck with me for the time being," she said as they sat on a bench outside the general store one afternoon. "At least until I can earn enough for a train ticket back east. You want to go back?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his tone neutral despite the sudden tightness in his chest at the thought of her leaving. Abigail considered this, watching a group of children play in the street nearby. "I don't know. There's nothing for me there, really. And despite my rather dramatic introduction to the West, I find I like it here. The openness, the sense of possibility. We could use a teacher," Samuel suggested. "The town's been trying to establish a proper school for over a year now. Currently, Mrs. Phillips teaches the children in the church 3 days a week, but she's expecting a baby soon." Abigail's eyes brightened with interest. "A real school? How many children?" "About 20 of school age, I'd reckon. The town council has funds set aside for a teacher's salary, but finding someone qualified who's willing to come all the way out here has been challenging." "I could speak with Mayor Phillips," Abigail said, a new energy in her voice. "If the position is still open, that is." Samuel couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "I think he'd be mighty pleased to hear of your interest." And he hesitated before adding, "I'd be pleased if you decided to stay in Clearwater Springs." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Abigail's cheeks flushed slightly and she looked away first. "That's very kind of you to say, Sheriff." "Samuel," he reminded her gently. "Samuel," she echoed with a small smile. The arrival of the weekly stagecoach interrupted their conversation, drawing their attention to the commotion at the far end of the street. It was always an event in town, bringing mail, supplies, occasional passengers, and news from the outside world. "Shall we see if there's any mail?" Samuel suggested, standing and offering his arm. Abigail hesitated before taking it, her touch light through the fabric of his shirt. "I'm not expecting any, but I'd like to walk with you all the same." As they made their way toward the stagecoach, Samuel noticed a rider approaching from the opposite direction, pushing his horse hard. The man's urgent manner set off alarm bells in Samuel's mind. "Wait here," he told Abigail, guiding her to the shade of the hardware store's awning. "Something's not right." The rider, a young ranch hand named Tyler who worked at the Bryce spread north of town, practically fell from his exhausted horse in front of the sheriff's office, calling for Samuel. "What is it, Tyler?" Samuel asked, hurrying over. "What's happened?" The young man was breathing hard, his face streaked with sweat and dust. "Riders, Sheriff, coming toward town from the north. Armed men, 5, maybe 6 of them, moving slow but deliberate-like. Mr. Bryce sent me to warn you, said they looked like trouble." Samuel's blood ran cold. Thornton's gang typically numbered 5. "How far out?" "Hour, maybe less. They stopped at our place asking questions. About a woman." Tyler's eyes flicked to Abigail, who had moved closer despite Samuel's instruction to wait. "Red-haired woman traveling alone." Abigail went pale, one hand flying to her throat. "They found me." Samuel's mind raced. If Thornton's gang was indeed coming for Abigail, they wouldn't hesitate to shoot anyone who got in their way. The town wasn't prepared for that kind of violence. "Tyler, find Deputy Wilson. He should be at the saloon. Tell him to meet me at the office immediately. Then start spreading the word women and children need to get indoors and stay there." As Tyler hurried off, Samuel turned to Abigail, taking her gently by the shoulders. I need to get you somewhere safe." "This is my fault," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "All these people, no time for that now," Samuel interrupted firmly. "Do you trust me?" She looked up at him, fear giving way to determination. "With my life I already have." Her words strengthened his resolve. "Then come with me." Quickly, Samuel led her not to the sheriff's office or the boarding house, but to the livery stable at the edge of town. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and horses greeted them as the stable boy looked up in surprise. "Sheriff, Miss Bennet, what's going on?" "Joey, I need my mare saddled right away and your fastest horse for Miss Bennet. No questions, son. It's urgent." Something in Samuel's tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because the boy jumped to work without another word. "Where are we going?" Abigail asked as Samuel checked his revolver and the Winchester rifle he kept at the office, which he'd collected on their way to the stable. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles south, near the creek. It's well hidden in a stand of cottonwoods. You'll be safe there while I deal with Thornton and his men." Abigail shook her head, alarm evident in her expression. "You can't face them alone, Samuel. There are too many." "I won't be alone. I have Deputy Wilson and several men in town I can deputize." He met her gaze steadily. "But I can't focus on stopping them if I'm worried about your safety. Please, Abigail, let me do this." After a moment of internal struggle visible on her face, she nodded. "All right, but promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said, surprising himself by taking her hand and pressing it briefly. "Joey, those horses ready?" "Yes, sir," the boy replied, leading out Samuel's chestnut mare and a spirited-looking bay for Abigail. "All saddled and ready to go." Samuel helped Abigail mount, noting with approval that she seemed comfortable on horseback. "Stay on the trail until you reach the creek, then follow it south. The cabin is set back about 50 yards from the water. It's not much, but there are supplies there: food, water, blankets." "How will I know when it's safe to return?" she asked, gathering the reins in her hands. "I'll come for you," he promised. "No matter what happens, I'll come for you." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Samuel was struck by an overwhelming urge to kiss her, inappropriate as it might be under the circumstances. Instead, he stepped back and nodded toward the stable's rear door. "Go now. Keep to the trees where you can. And Abigail." He hesitated, then finished. "Stay safe." "You too, Sheriff," she replied softly, before urging her horse forward and disappearing through the door Joey held open. Samuel watched until she was out of sight, then turned his attention to the approaching threat. If Garrett Thornton wanted Abigail Bennet, he'd have to go through Samuel Reed first, and Samuel had no intention of letting that happen. By the time Samuel gathered Deputy Wilson and 5 other men he trusted with firearms, the outlaws were visible on the northern approach to town. They rode in a loose formation, unhurried but purposeful, dust rising from their horses' hooves in the late afternoon sun. "That's them all right," Samuel told his hastily assembled posse as they took positions along Main Street. "Garrett Thornton and his gang. They're wanted for robbery, kidnapping, and murder across 3 territories. They're here for Miss Bennet, but we're not giving her to them." "Where is she?" Deputy Wilson asked, checking the ammunition in his revolver. "Somewhere safe," Samuel replied, unwilling to share the exact location even with men he trusted. "All you need to know is that she's not in town, and we need to make sure these men never find her." The plan was simple. Let the outlaws enter town, confront them in the wide area near the center of Main Street where there would be minimal risk to civilians, and demand their surrender. Samuel harbored no illusions that men like Thornton would give up peacefully, but he was determined to give them the chance and to be ready when they inevitably refused. "Remember," he told his men, These aren't common drunks or cattle rustlers. They're killers who won't hesitate to shoot. Stay in cover, watch each other's backs, and for God's sake, make your shots count. The town had gone eerily quiet as the riders approached. Doors were locked, shutters closed, and the usual afternoon bustle replaced by tense silence. Samuel stepped out into the middle of the street, alone, his badge catching the sunlight as he planted his feet firmly in the dust. The lead rider, a tall man with cold blue eyes that Samuel recognized from wanted posters, as Garrett Thornton himself raised a hand to halt his companions when they were about 30 yards away. For a long moment, the two men simply regarded each other across the distance. "This is a quiet town you've got here, Sheriff," Thornton called, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "Hate to disturb the peace." "Then don't," Samuel replied evenly. "Turn around and ride out. There's nothing for you in Clearwater Springs." A smile that didn't reach those cold eyes spread across Thornton's face. "Now, I think there is. A girl, pretty little thing with red hair. Word is she's been staying in your town." "No one fitting that description here," Samuel lied, his hand resting near his holstered Colt. "You've had a wasted journey, Thornton." The outlaw's eyebrows rose slightly at the use of his name. "So you know who I am. That should tell you I'm not a man to be trifled with, Sheriff. The girl belongs to me. She stole from me when she ran, and I aim to get back what's mine." "Women aren't property," Samuel responded, anger edging into his voice despite his efforts to remain calm. "And from what I hear, you stole her first along with the valuables of everyone on that stagecoach you robbed. That makes you a kidnapper and a thief, both hanging offenses in this territory." Thornton's expression hardened. "I don't much care for your tone, lawman, or for being called a liar." His hand moved toward his gun. "Last chance. Where's the girl?" Samuel tensed, ready to draw. "Not here, and you're not welcome either. I'm placing you and your men under arrest for robbery, kidnapping, and murder. Throw down your weapons and dismount." A tense silence followed his words. Samuel could feel sweat trickling down his back despite the cooling air of approaching evening. Behind Thornton, his men shifted in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. Then Thornton laughed a cold, humorless sound. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered, Sheriff, and I don't see a jail cell in my future." "You might be surprised," Samuel replied, nodding slightly to signal his hidden deputies. "You're the ones who are outnumbered." On cue, Deputy Wilson and the other men revealed themselves, rifles and revolvers trained on the outlaws from strategic positions along the street. For a brief moment, Samuel thought Thornton might reconsider. The outlaw's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, clearly not having expected such resistance in a small town. But then one of Thornton's men, a burly figure with a distinctive scar through his eyebrow that marked him as Dutch, made a sudden move, drawing his pistol with startling speed. Samuel's revolver cleared his holster a split second later as gunfire erupted from both sides. He dove for cover behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around him, the peaceful afternoon shattered by the deadly exchange. Through the chaos, Samuel caught glimpses of the battle unfolding. Deputy Wilson scoring a hit on one of the outlaws, sending the man tumbling from his saddle. Another of his deputies falling with a cry as a bullet found its mark. Thornton's men scattering for cover as their initial advantage of being mounted turned into a liability in the narrow confines of the street. Samuel took careful aim and fired at a rider trying to flank their position, satisfaction mingling with grim determination as the man clutched his shoulder and veered away. These men had terrorized innocent travelers, kidnapped Abigail, and would have sold her to a fate worse than death. Whatever happened here today, they had to be stopped. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes, though it seemed much longer to those involved. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Thornton's men lay dead or wounded in the street. Another had surrendered, hands raised as Deputy Wilson kept him covered. But Thornton himself and Dutch had managed to break away during the confusion, galloping south out of town, the same direction Samuel had sent Abigail. Cold fear gripped Samuel's heart as he realized the implication. Had they somehow known where she was headed? Or was it terrible coincidence? "Wilson," he shouted, checking his ammunition and reloading quickly. "Get the wounded seen to and lock that one up. I'm going after Thornton, alone," the deputy called back, disbelief evident in his voice. "That's suicide, Sheriff. No choice," Samuel replied grimly, already running for the livery where he'd left his horse saddled. They're headed straight for Miss Bennet. The ride south was a blur of urgency and fear. Samuel pushed his mare harder than he ever had before, following the clear tracks of Thornton and Dutch. They had a head start, but Samuel knew the land better and had greater motivation. Every second could mean the difference between life and death for Abigail. The sun was beginning to set when Samuel spotted smoke rising from the direction of the trapper's cabin. His blood ran cold. Forcing his tired horse to a final burst of speed, he approached more cautiously as he neared the stand of cottonwoods, dismounting and securing his mare, before proceeding on foot with his Winchester ready. The scene that greeted him made his heart stutter. The small cabin was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the dry timber. Nearby, Dutch lay face down in the dirt, unmoving, a spreading pool of blood beneath him. Of Thornton and Abigail there was no immediate sign. "Abigail," Samuel called, scanning the area desperately. "Abigail!" A commotion from the direction of the creek drew his attention. Moving quickly but cautiously through the trees, Samuel came upon a sight that momentarily froze him in place. Garrett Thornton had Abigail backed against the trunk of a massive cottonwood, his revolver pressed to her temple. Despite her obvious fear, her chin was raised defiantly, and Samuel could see a bloodied rock clutched in her right hand. "Drop the rifle, Sheriff," Thornton ordered, his cold eyes flicking to Samuel, "or the schoolteacher gets a bullet in her pretty head." Samuel hesitated, assessing the situation. He might be able to get a shot off, but at this distance, with the failing light and Thornton using Abigail as a shield, it was too risky. "Let her go, Thornton," he said, slowly lowering the Winchester but not dropping it entirely. "It's over. Your men are dead or captured. There's nowhere left to run." "There's always somewhere to run in this country," Thornton replied with a sneer. "And she's coming with me. Insurance, you might say. Once I'm clear, I might let her go, or I might not. Depends on my mood." Samuel's gaze met Abigail's, and in that moment, a silent communication passed between them. He saw not just fear in her eyes, but trust and determination. "You're not taking her anywhere," Samuel stated flatly. "And you're not leaving here a free man. Those are the only certainties right now." Thornton's face twisted with anger. "You don't give the orders here, lawman." "I do. Now drop the rifle," or in that instant of distraction, Abigail made her move. With surprising strength, she slammed the rock in her hand against Thornton's wrist, causing him to cry out in pain and his gun to discharge harmlessly into the air. As his grip on her loosened, she twisted away, giving Samuel the clear shot he needed. The Winchester roared once, and Garrett Thornton crumpled to the ground, a look of stunned disbelief on his face as life faded from those cold blue eyes. For a moment, neither Samuel nor Abigail moved, the echo of the gunshot seeming to hang in the air between them. Then Samuel was rushing forward, gathering her into his arms as relief flooded through him. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pulling back to examine her face, which was smudged with soot and tear tracks. "No," she gasped, her whole body trembling with reaction. "I'm all right. I heard them coming and hid in the woods, but they saw the smoke from the stove and started searching. Dutch found me first, but I hit him with a branch. Then Thornton caught me near the creek." Her words tumbled out in a rush before she suddenly stopped, looking up at Samuel with wide eyes. "You came for me, just like you promised." "Of course I did," Samuel replied softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that belied the violence of moments before. "I'll always come for you, Abigail." The truth of his words resonated between them, heavy with meaning neither had dared acknowledge until now. Slowly, as if drawn by some invisible force, Samuel lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that spoke of relief, passion, and promises yet to be made. When they finally parted, Abigail's cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were clear and certain as they met his. "Take me home, Samuel," she whispered. "Take me home to Clearwater Springs." In the months that followed, Clearwater Springs gradually returned to its peaceful routine. The showdown with Thornton's gang became the stuff of local legend, embellished with each retelling at the saloon. Deputy Wilson recovered from his wound and wore the scar with pride, especially when recounting the tale to wide-eyed newcomers. Abigail took up the position as the town's schoolteacher, winning over children and parents alike with her gentle authority and genuine passion for learning. The town council converted an abandoned storefront into a proper schoolhouse, complete with new desks, books, and a bell that rang out each morning to call the children to their lessons. Samuel continued his duties as sheriff, though townspeople noticed he found more reasons than ever to pass by the schoolhouse during the day. Few were surprised when, 6 months after the events with Thornton's gang, he and Abigail announced their engagement. Their wedding, held in the white-steepled church on a perfect day in early May, was attended by the entire town. Mrs. Henderson wept openly, claiming she'd known from the first day that the sheriff and the schoolteacher were meant for each other. Mayor Phillips gave a speech about fate and finding love in unexpected places that had his pregnant wife dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. As Samuel and Abigail shared their first dance as husband and wife in the town hall, decorated with wildflowers and ribbons for the occasion, he pulled her close and whispered in her ear, "Did you ever imagine, when you were lying in the dust that day, that this is where you'd end up?" Abigail smiled up at him, love shining in her eyes. "I don't remember much about that day, except feeling your coat around me and knowing somehow that I was safe, that I'd found home." Samuel's throat tightened with emotion as he remembered the frail, dust-covered woman he'd discovered on the trail, so different from the vibrant, confident teacher in his arms now. "You know, I still have that coat. It's seen better days, but I can't bring myself to replace it." "Don't you dare," she teased, reaching up to touch his cheek. "That coat is part of our story." "The beginning of it, anyway," Samuel agreed, spinning her gently as the music continued around them. "We have many more chapters to write, Mrs. Reed." Her new name brought a fresh smile to Abigail's face. "I like the sound of that. Mrs. Abigail Reed, schoolteacher of Clearwater Springs, and wife of the luckiest sheriff in Wyoming Territory," Samuel added, unable to resist stealing a kiss despite the cheers and good-natured whistles from the onlookers. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, a small but sturdy house on the edge of town that Samuel had been quietly building in his spare time, Abigail leaned against her husband's shoulder and gazed up at the star-filled sky. "Do you ever think about how many things had to happen exactly as they did for us to find each other?" she asked thoughtfully. If the stagecoach hadn't been robbed, if I hadn't escaped, if you hadn't been riding that particular trail on that particular day. Samuel wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her closer against the evening chill. I try not to dwell on the ifs, darling. I'm just grateful for what is. But yes, sometimes I wonder at the chain of events that brought you to me. Some might call it fate, Abigail mused. Or divine providence, Samuel suggested. Either way, I thank God every day that I found you, even if the circumstances were less than ideal. Abigail turned in his arms to face him, her expression suddenly serious. I've never properly thanked you, have I, for saving my life that day? Samuel shook his head, cupping her face gently. You don't need to thank me. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Abigail. You brought light and purpose back into my life when I didn't even realize how much I needed it. As you did for me, she whispered, standing on tiptoe to press her lips to his in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. In the years that followed, Samuel and Abigail Reed became pillars of the Clearwater Springs community. The school flourished under Abigail's guidance, eventually expanding to include a small library named in her honor. Samuel continued as sheriff until the territory achieved statehood, at which point he was elected the county's first official sheriff, a position he held with dignity and fairness that became his hallmark. Their home grew too, with the addition of a daughter, Emma, born a year after their wedding, and twin boys, James and William, who arrived 2 years later. The Reed children were raised on stories of courage and perseverance, though the more frightening details of their parents' first meeting were softened until they were old enough to understand. On the 10th anniversary of the day Samuel found Abigail in the dust, they returned to the spot now marked by a small cairn of stones they'd placed years earlier. The old leather duster, worn and faded but carefully preserved, was wrapped around Abigail's shoulders despite the warmth of the summer day. 10 years, Samuel marveled, his hair now touched with silver at the temples but his eyes as kind and sharp as ever. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like another lifetime. Another lifetime, Abigail agreed, leaning into his embrace. At 32, she was still as beautiful to him as the day he'd first seen her truly awake in Doc Miller's office, her green eyes full of life and determination. The life before you found me. Samuel pressed a kiss to her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender that had long since replaced the dust and desperation of their first encounter. I'd find you again, you know, in any lifetime, in any circumstance. I'd always find you. And I'd always be waiting, Abigail replied softly, turning in his arms to face the man who had not only saved her life but had given her a home, a family, and a love that had only deepened with each passing year. Even if I didn't know I was waiting for you. As they stood together on that lonely stretch of trail, now well-traveled and bordered by settlements that had sprung up as the territory prospered, neither Samuel nor Abigail Reed could imagine a life different from the one they'd built together. From the most desperate of beginnings, a half-dead woman lying in the dust and a lonely lawman who covered her with his coat, had grown a love as vast and enduring as the western sky above them. And somewhere in the distance, the bell of Clearwater Springs schoolhouse rang out, calling their children and all the others home for dinner, a sound of civilization and community in what had once been wilderness, a reminder of how far they had come, and how the simple act of human kindness could change not just 2 lives, but an entire world.